Hey, this is Brian at Cohesity, and I want to show you how to inspect the REST API calls made when the UI is used. Um, Cohesity is 100% REST API driven, so the UI does nothing but make REST API calls to the Cohesity cluster. We can watch this. I'm using Chrome here, but all browsers have a developer console. In Chrome, it's under More Tools, Developer Tools, and then we want to focus on the Network tab, and then the XHR sub tab. So, and then we can just exercise the UI, and we'll see the protection groups or the API calls being made. So in this case, I'm getting the list of protection groups because I clicked on data protection. And you can see here that this is the API call that was made to get that information. So in this case, the URL was v2 data protection groups and with some query parameters. And the request method was a get. So, and then you can see the response, the JSON response that was sent back by the cluster, and this provides the information needed to paint this information on the screen. There's also a preview tab which allows you to dig through it in a little bit more controlled fashion, a little easier to read. And for each one of these protection groups, you see the configuration of the protection group. And in this case, because we asked for last run info equals true, each one has last run info. That's where it gets the last start time and status and so forth, right? So when you're creating a new protection group, we're going to be creating a payload that's very similar to what we see here. So let's go and walk through that. I'm going to clear my list here, and I'm going to protect some virtual machines. So right away, we've made a couple of API calls. We've got what the API calls view boxes, or what are more recently known as storage domains. It gets the list of storage domains on the cluster, so it has a list of where to store new protection groups. So in this case, I'm going to use the default storage domain, so that has an ID of 5. It also gets the list of root nodes or protection source nodes that are things that hold VMs, like vCenter, Hyper-V, AWS, Azure, etc. So you see this API call, this get v1 public protection sources root nodes, where environments are, Acropolis, AWS, Azure, GCP, et cetera. And it found that I have 2 of those registered on my system. One, an Azure subscription. Another is a vCenter, right? So when I go to add objects, those 2 things show up in my list to be able to select. When I select one, it makes an API call to get, for that specific, got the ID of that vCenter from the previous API call, and send a new API call to get the entire hierarchy of subordinates underneath that vCenter, right? Let me move this down a little bit so we can see a little better. Data centers, hosts, VMs, and so forth, right? The whole hierarchy. So that allows me to then go through and find VMs I want to add to this protection group. So I'm going to say Linux. So I'm going to select a couple of VMs here, Linux 9A and Linux 9B. Add them to the protection group. I'm going to give this a name. And then I'm going to go pick a policy. As soon as I click on the policy section, it goes and makes the API call to get the list of policies on my system. And then we can take a look at those. You see each one has a name, each one has an ID, right? So I select the policy I want. And at this point, I have all the information I need to create this new VM protection group. Real quick, I'm just going to go to more options and pause it so it doesn't actually run. And then I'm going to click protect. So before I do that, just take note of all the different API calls it made to look up the different things that we needed for this protection group. Okay, and then I'm going to clear it, and then I'm going to click protect. So here's the actual API call that creates the protection group. This is a post, and a post requires usually a payload. Here's the raw payload in JSON, but Chrome gives you a nice parsed view of it. So and you can see there's my policy ID, there's my store as domain ID. Here are the IDs for each of the VMs that I selected. And so this is a working payload for creating a protection group with a couple of VMs in it. So I was able to identify each API call that was made in the process of gathering the information to build this payload. And then the ultimate payload here is a great working example that I can just steal from the UI, right? This is how I do most of my work when I'm trying to automate a workflow in Cohesity. I perform the workflow in the UI, capture the API calls, and then I can take this over to PowerShell or Python or curl or whatever, parameterize the data, and I've got myself an automated workflow, right? If I want to look more closely at the documentation for this API call, we can go right on the cluster. I can go to Docs, API, V1 and V2. The UI you'll see uses a combination of V1 APIs and V2 APIs. So I can look at the V1 APIs here. And so, for example, that ViewBoxes API to get the list of storage domains, that's right here. Or we can go and look at the V2 documentation. And you can look at protection group post. So this is the API call that was just made to create that protection group. And you can look through all the documentation, all the options. And there's a lot of options, right? There's a lot of different types of protection groups in Cohesity, and each one has individual parameters specific to that environment. So like, when you're protecting VMs, you have a VMware params that has all the different settings relevant to that. If I select, say, for example, a physical server protection group, that has physical params that are entirely different. So I wouldn't recommend that you try to build a payload from scratch based purely on the documentation, because it's pretty complicated. But the easy thing to do is, like I just showed you, walk through the workflow in the UI and capture the API calls and the payloads and so forth that the API produces. Those are perfect working examples, and it's the easy way to grab what you need, grab the examples you need to build your own automation.